Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this In Conversation event with the Right Honourable Dame Priti Patel MP. It is a packed room, so we're going to get straight into it. For those that aren't familiar with the work of the Coalition for Global Prosperity, we believe that an active diplomatic agenda, a strong defence and a robust aid budget, all working together, can make the UK punch above its weight in the world. That's British leadership in action, and that UK leadership can help alleviate poverty and bring security and prosperity, not just to the UK, but to those around the world who need it most. I'm sure all of you know who our guest is today. I'd like to start by asking you about the announcement from the Shadow Chancellor today. Given development is part of your brief.
Of course, yes.
So could you reflect on that?
I could have anticipated that.
Yeah, sorry. And for those who aren't familiar,
yeah.
the Chancellor has said that the Shadow Chancellor said he will cut the aid budget when the Conservatives return to power at the next election.
Well, look, good afternoon, everyone. It's super to see you all. And Ryan, thank you for hosting us. And let me just start by thanking you for all the work you, the Coalition for Global Prosperity, do and have done. Because they're an important organisation, but actually don't forget, as a party, we're going through a policy renewal process, and the team and Ryan are doing a lot of work with us, and that's really very important because the world is changing and there are big challenges that we all face. And in relation to development budget, development aid, whatever you want to call it, ODA, Mel Stride has today said that we will be reducing our ODA. And let me just put this within the context of where we stand, not just as a country, but also about our record around the world. First and foremost, look, we're in a time and an era where public spending is incredibly tight. I don't need to think I have to unpack that too much. And of course, development spending has always been linked to GDP, economic growth in our country, you name it. But the reality is, in a very contested world that we live in, we need to spend our development budget in a way in which it works for us. And it works in our national interests. And, you know, even my less than 12 months doing the role that I do right now as a shadow foreign affairs portfolio, I think it's really important that we also have to recognise that we are a country. Britain is a country. We're not an open-ended charity. We've got to do things differently when it comes to development aid. My time when I was in international development, I'll give you, Ryan's heard me say this before, but I'll give you this anecdote and insight. I was the one that brought in greater conditionality around our aid budget. I was not embarrassed to do that. I was criticised heavily for doing it. I was the one that actually reviewed how we invested in multilateral development banks, did replenishments differently, put conditions around the United Nations, and look at where we are today actually with the United States, who, by the way, the United States at the time criticised me. That was the first Trump administration for the approach that I took, and look at what they have chosen to do. We don't vacate the pitch. We make sure we are there in the right way, but put in our national interests first. And that's basically the direction of travel that we'll be working on over the months and years ahead.
Now, we've heard lots of talk over the last few years about the rules-based international order and how we are now past that time. So this system that had overseen foreign affairs since the Second World War has come to an end, and we're perhaps in a pre-war era instead. Do you think all is lost for that rules-based international order? If you think it is, what comes next, and how should the UK be seeking to respond?
So I think it's a really good question, and we need to, if I may, we've got to unpack your question a little bit. The rules-based system, as we know it, exists for very good reasons. The past consensus, post-war, post-conflict, those institutions were created really for peace and prosperity purposes. And they have served the test of time, they've been challenged, but within the context of the world that we live in right now, let's just look at the landscape. It's a contested landscape. It's deeply challenged. We have an axis of authoritarianism around the world. We have populism sweeping parts of the world. We have political systems, institutions, and political parties being redefined. So I think, the short answer to your question is we've got to change things. But the long-term approach is that we have to make these institutions fit for purpose. We have to update some of the parameters under which they operate and work. I personally think, classic example, I've heard this around this conference a lot, we're talking about leaving the ECHR, that's just one example, where we stand on things like the Refugee Convention. I spent a lot of time in Geneva. In the past, working with UN agencies, even when I was Home Secretary, I had many of them getting the megaphone out at me, but they all recognise fundamentally that the current system is not working. It's not meeting public expectations, for example. It's not letting legislators, elected politicians and lawmakers govern their countries and do what they need to do in their countries for their own electorate. And when they can't deliver, so this is the ultimate thing, when your lawmakers and decision makers can't deliver for your own electorate, guess what happens? Others come in and fill the vacuum or join the pitch, the populists, basically promising all sorts of things. The authoritarians, actually upending the rules-based system, because that's what they're doing. They actually undermine the rule of law, in my view, as well. So these are the areas where I personally think, look, we're in opposition, we're not in power. This is beyond just running the slide rule over our institutions. We're the generation, I think, that has to make them work for the future, anticipate how these institutions need to develop and evolve for the future as well. We're speaking about their longevity and demonstrate flexibility to actually drive the type of outcomes. It won't be the original outcomes, but the frameworks are there. It's how do we update those frameworks?
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned just then the axis of authoritarianism. Can you offer some reflections on the role of Russia and Iran? We know that they're running disinformation campaigns, for example. Again, how does society and how do we adapt to that?
So this is a really serious issue, and it's not just an issue that's topical because of, we've got war in Ukraine, etc., etc. This is an issue that's going to be with us for a long, long time. And by the way, it has been. And I know because I've seen it at the cold face. I pay a great deal of, a degree of tribute actually to some of the organisations, the GCHQs of this world, some of our intelligence and security systems that do so much to protect us. I've seen it in government from even before the COVID pandemic, but a lot of even China, not just Iran, but Russia and China attacking government systems. So classically, when I was a DWP minister, we almost had scorecards or like dashboards where you could see the number of attacks, cyber attacks, hybrid attacks on our payment systems in DWP, that would literally upend and disrupt the entire network and system. So this has been going on for ages. However, of course, what drives this is their ability to paralyse governments, Western governments, undermine our values, undermine our institutions, cause and, sow the seeds of chaos, basically, as well. And the architects of this are Russia, China, and Iran. Iran is just extraordinary because, of course, they use proxies. And we know the sort of military proxies that they use, which isn't just, that's still cyber, that's military. The Houthis, Hezbollah, the list is well known. But on the cyber side of things with the Iranians, they also use proxies in our own country to cause disruption. And the Chinese do the same. They do it through our institutions. This is well known. It's written about. Confucius institutions, academic institutions, universities. The list is endless. What's interesting, I have to say, about China is the government under David Lammy as Foreign Secretary. They undertook a China audit, and I have to say I think this government speaks out of both sides of its mouth when it comes to China. I really do, and I don't think they're sincere about an understanding the real threat that China poses. They conducted an audit that they would not make public. They redacted a huge amount of it, knowing that China is an adversary and hugely problematic in this hybrid area for us. But yet, they're sort of saying, well, it's all a bit of work in progress, and it's just like, my view is it's not work in progress. We, Britain, we have such significant equities and agency here. we could actually work with so many allies in the West and our European friends and allies as well to protect ourselves, invest and innovate in really good ways. I don't think we're doing anywhere near as much as we can do. I know we did a lot when we were in government, but that doesn't matter because you've got to keep developing, it's got to keep evolving. And then Russia we have to speak about because of Russian disinformation and their networks. Obviously, we have war in Ukraine, but on top of that, they are causing destabilization through political interference in many other countries. So let's just talk about Georgia and Moldova, for example. You know, opposition leaders in Georgia, many of whom I met recently, within a week of meeting me, and this isn't a cause and effect issue, they've been imprisoned. You know, the Russians are taking over the democratic institutions of these countries. They're trying to install puppet governments. This is the extent of what Russia is doing and the scale of it all. So it's really serious. It's hugely serious. And even if I may, Ryan, vis-a-vis our aid budget, of course, you know, this is where we've been investing. This is where we stand up for democracy, our values and freedoms and things of that nature. And that's why, you know, we need the Americans to do more in this space. They have the technology, they have the know-how, we do as well. But this, for me, is a big area where through the likes of the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, some of the networks we have with our sister parties, we as a centre-right party are very much trying to, you know, bring about the change that we need to see in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to come back to America, but as you mentioned China, we've heard China labelled a threat, an opportunity, a challenge, and I'm thinking particularly about the collapse of the court case and the spying of Parliament. Do you think Parliament and the current government take China as seriously as they ought to? You've mentioned they're looking both ways.
Yeah.
What more can they be doing?
There is a lot to say here. There really is. I mean, just on this case, you're reading about it in the newspapers every day. There are serious issues here for the British government who have to respond, and they've got questions to answer on this. It seems to us now that there was political involvement in this because the government, it's pretty apparent, they're cozying up to China. The economic situation in this country is pretty dire. We don't have the level of investment, etc. You guys all know the situation there. And they do not want to. So it sounds like this is a Foreign Office posture. Foreign Office posture is very friendly to China. And they're desperate for more trade cooperation and all of that. And we know President Trump is also looking for his largest trade deal in the world. But on top of this, let's be very clear about China. Let's just talk about Hong Kong. So look at everything that's happened in Hong Kong with the national security law, the draconian national security law. Look at the persecutions of British nationals overseas, what that has meant. Look at the politically motivated trial of Jimmy Lai. All this kind of stuff, you know, I don't see a government being forceful on this front at all. We've got BNOs actually with bounties on their heads in our own country. That's unprecedented. Talk about, you know, transgressing boundaries and, you know, overreach. This is effectively what we're seeing. And so I'm afraid, you know, David Lammy was not exactly the most robust character, you know, when he's on his sort of like missions to China. Yvette Cooper will not be a robust character, there's no doubt about it. And she's still sort of got to find her feet in that department. But then, of course, who do we see going to China out of the government? We see Ed Miliband. I mean, you can make your own mind up about that. We see the business secretaries, not one, but two have gone already. You see Keir Starmer having dialogue as well. You see Rachel Reeves, the economic financial development dialogue has resumed all over again. They're all fine to go over for all those sort of, you know, the photo ops and the PR and, you know, talking about the economic aspect, but what about the fundamental issues of the national security of our country? And when it comes to the economic subject around China and China being an opportunity, you know, there's always going to be an economic relationship, but we do not compromise the national security of our country. And on the economic side, look at what China is doing on technology. It is extraordinary. It's incredible, by the way. It is incredible and it's extraordinary. But are we going to basically say we'll have all of that at any price and at any cost? The answer should be no. You have to go in with your eyes wide open. I don't think this government's naive. I think they're desperate. They're absolutely desperate. And that's before I even come on to the parallels between socialism and communism and the type of political approaches that they're taking. I used to wind David Lammy up a lot about this in the House, and he used to get very upset. But it's a serious issue. It's a really, really serious issue. And I think every government, every Western democracy has to grip this issue and take a very serious approach to this.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll come back to this when we come to questions. Going back to international development for a moment, when you were Secretary of State for International Development, you spoke about the importance of trade as well as aid, which myself and others in this sector really, really welcomed. Can you say a bit more about that, given the tightening of belts, not just in the UK, but in the US and across Europe?
Sure. Well, I was the first Secretary of State to put together an economic development outlook and strategy for the department, which I thought was completely extraordinary. So economic development, that is businesses, trade, investment, how we can create jobs in different parts of the world rather than just giving out handouts. I've got very clear views. I'm on the record, quoted over many years, that we have to end this culture of handouts. We literally, I believe, the ladder of opportunity, fundamental conservative principles, applying that to development, how you can invest in countries to stop people, and this does link to the global migration debate and discussion. So when I was in DFID, we had obviously mass migration taking place, we had wars and conflicts, Syria, etc., Turkey, leading a global migration pact and treaty. Those were not the answer. That was not the answer. We have to invest in these countries and help people and countries stand on their own 2 feet. You don't do that by constant handouts. You really don't. That is not helping countries develop. That's not encouraging investment. And I fundamentally believe that, Britain is at its best. I look at our country, and I've got a private sector background, and I knew that annoyed everybody when I was in DFID. There's no doubt about that. Because I was constantly speaking to businesses that want to invest overseas, businesses with supply chains, people that wanted to create jobs and investment. And by the way, when we had the Syria crisis, and our dear friends in Jordan were having to build the refugee camps like Zaatari, for example, hundreds upon hundreds of people, thousands of people were living in those camps. We effectively, Jordan and other countries in the region were saying, help us stop being dependents and recipients of aid, help us do something with people and train them and educate them and get them employed. Well, you can't just, there are no government-created jobs. You need the private sector to come into those countries. So an economic development strategy is effectively what I led. I've taken out delegations of businesses, different sectors, manufacturing being one of the big ones in particular, particularly to countries like Ethiopia. This was before Ethiopia then had a terrible political crisis of its own. Great opportunities there. East Africa, I've worked in East Africa over many, many years. Some really natural partnerships and synergies. I did a lot of work with Trademark East Africa, through the ports of Mombasa, about getting goods in, turning them around fast, dealing with trade barriers and things of that nature. This is the type of stuff that allows capital to flow, creates jobs, helps make these countries business friendly, absolutely. But importantly, gives people in those countries hope. They want hope and opportunity. They want to know that they're going to have jobs and economic security. No different, by the way, in our own countries, right? That's what we all want for our people and for our citizens. And that's very much what drove me. And I feel very passionately about this. We've got to give people hope. It's a great principle of conservatism, but we've also got to stop this hemorrhaging of people leaving countries in such a dangerous, dangerous way. Paying people smugglers is an evil trade, full stop. And a lot of these African countries, they're losing people, brain drains, etc., etc. They're not going to stand on their own 2 feet without having the right kind of investment. So for us, it was creating the right kind of pathways to do that.
Yeah, and having also taken delegations out to Zaatari, amongst other places, I know exactly what you mean in terms of that message of hope. I mean, you've just articulated brilliantly why defence, diplomacy, development, trade should all work coherently. One of the things that we find when we do polling and focus groups is that the general public don't tend to make that link. Why do you think that is? Is that a case of politicians perhaps confusing altruism with strategic national security arguments, or does the message just need to be made a bit more?
So, I mean, look, as much as I've been in these roles, I had the role of development and been in other government jobs over recent years. I think fundamentally, times have changed. Like I said earlier on, we live in a contested world, hugely contested. Things are changing, and I think politicians need to actually invest some time with the public actually on these debates and discussions. I'm really happy to do that. I think that's really important, because we're living in a world, as much as it's a contested world, we're living in a world where I think partly down to the nature of politics. I think I can say this post the general election result last year, where there's more populism. Everyone's got a view on, well, we can just do this and everything will be so simple and so fine. And, there's this very simple narrative that has just gripped public life and politics, not just in our country, but across the world as well, and in Europe. And so I do think we have to demonstrate that everything is interconnected. It really is. And, I mean, Europe is a good model for this, actually, when you think about war on our continent in Europe, Russia, Ukraine. It was conservative policies and politics and leadership that brought economic prosperity and economic security by ending the Cold War. Now, that was back in the day. That was a long time ago. However, we have to demonstrate that we can have a secure country, secure futures for ourselves, our children, our families, our grandchildren, by bringing all these equities and strands together. And I think I personally think British government's going to have to reshape itself going forward. We're doing that work right now in our party. I think all this stuff about, X department does this, X department does that, it's for the birds, because it's really interconnected. I saw this when I was Home Secretary, the defence team. Ben was Defence Secretary when I was Home Secretary. Ben Wallace and I worked together. It's nothing to do with the fact that we were good colleagues. We understood the system, the interconnection, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's Ukraine, whether it was hybrid, grey zone, the type of things where we all had to work together, whether it was support for our military, what could we do that was proactive and positive, whether it's working with our allies around the world, in Europe, on the eastern flank, all of that, at the time of Ukraine, through Five Eyes. And I think we have to change our systems to actually bring all this together in a very significant way. Government machinery doesn't lend itself to this at all. In fact, the machinery government, and I think you might have heard Mel Stride speak today about reforms that he'd like to bring to the civil service. I back those 1,000%, I really do. Because you've got officials in various fiefdoms sitting in silos, and this is where the machinery of government effectively breaks down. It doesn't help. It results in the lack of delivery, then we all lose elections off the back of it. And it's that level of integration, but also bringing experience to the table. And I use the word experience because we are living in this era of a bit of lazy, sloppy politics where everything is very simple and the public perception is it's also easy and expectations are high, but, its delivery is very different. So I think there's more that we can do. And I genuinely believe, just speaking frankly about our party, the Conservative Party and the team that we have, we've got a lot of people with government experience, a lot of people with experience in these areas where we know that level of integration would transform Britain's place in the world. I want to be the Foreign Secretary that's fighting for Britain and flying the flag for Britain, providing the leadership that actually not only we will give, for our country, but to some of our friends and allies who are finding it equally very hard and very difficult right now. And I think it's quite natural for us as Conservatives. We know how to convene, pull people together, tie networks together, and a lot of this is all about political will. You've got to have the political will, the direction to do this, and I'm in that space.
Mm-hmm. And of course, there's no more important network than the special relationship. So President Trump had an unprecedented second state visit. Can you comment on the state of the special relationship? Is it really going through a change for the worse, as so many commentators suggest, or can we be more hopeful?
Commentators got a lot to answer for, haven't they? I can say that. That visit was extraordinary. It was absolutely extraordinary. And I'll just share this with you. Last week I was at the Warsaw Security Conference, which, as we've been saying, security, development, everything is all linked together. all people wanted to ask me about was the unprecedented second state visit and the state of the relationship between our two countries. And what is so interesting, so our friends from the United States Ambassador and his team will be here throughout Party Conference, so I think that tells you everything about the relationship between our two parties as well, because that's really important. It's a dynamic relationship, and I think that's a really important way to phrase the relationship. We can look back, and I do. I put my hand up. We all look back starry-eyed to the days of Thatcher and Reagan. Iconic leaders in the world, end of the Cold War, all of that. We've got so much. We have so much respect for them, but it's a dynamic relationship now because the American government have changed the parameters of all engagement, and trade, for example, we've got tariffs. So Britain has tariffs. We as Conservatives don't believe in tariffs, we believe in free trade. So that's a different conversation we're now having. Security is an issue that I do know about. Five Eyes, I do know about. There are security areas that we have tremendous work taking place on. So that's more than dynamic. That's embedded. That is absolutely embedded. It really is. So it's a relationship that has many, many layers that I think the term special relationship just masquerades, the real substance and the depth of everything that's going on. And recently, this was about a week before the unprecedented second state visit, I was having some discussions with some American officials in London, and the crucial thing is that they're learning from us. They're engaged with us, and I say this, when I say learning from us, I don't mean the Labour government. They're learning from us. They're listening to us, which is incredibly important, because they also know we have very strong networks around the world. I mean, just if you see the international delegations we've got at conference, it's pretty phenomenal. They know we're out there as well, but they also recognise, and this is a sister party point now, they know that, we're on the same page on the fundamental values, freedoms, democracy, the challenges that we face together. And they don't see eye to eye with the government on everything as well, I can tell you that. State visits are all for the niceties and the visuals and everything else. And it's important that visit really went well, and it did. And, we're delighted. And, we thank His Majesty for the big investment that the royal family put into all of that as well. But, it's a very dynamic discussion that takes place with us as well about some of these big issues and big challenges. And they do talk to us about the more crunchier things, I should say, outside of state visits.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Foreign policy is an area which typically commands a bit more consensus than domestic policy. I'd be very interested to know where you think the government is getting it wrong on foreign policy, and what you would do differently.
So, look, when I took this role last year, I never thought that foreign policy was going to be in the news 24/7 to the extent that it is, and it's also affecting domestic politics in the way in which it is. So foreign policy historically has always been one of those subject matters over there, and governments are just consumed by all the domestic stuff. Now, we've got a government here that's absolutely consumed by everything, including itself and its own party, backbench MPs that are obviously dictating foreign policy, is how I see it. The government have got a lot wrong. They've got a hell of a lot wrong internationally, they really have. So state visits aside, all the sort of pleasantries and all the sort of, that's the bigger diplomatic stuff, that's the top stuff, that's the visuals. The real gritty diplomacy takes place behind closed doors, where you roll your sleeves up and you've got to have really, quite frankly, very difficult conversations. And those difficult conversations, it's pretty self-evident the government finds it hard to have difficult conversations. They can't even talk to their own backbenchers and sort of, deal with some of the domestic things that they've got to do. I mean, look at the row they had on welfare and how they capitulated to their backbenchers. So where should we start? Let's just start with the Middle East for now, right? So whatever one thinks, views on two-state and recognising Palestine. I've been in Parliament almost every month where I have seen Labour backbenchers dominate the thinking of the front bench and dictate to the front bench what the foreign policy should be. Our friends from Israel were here yesterday. The Deputy Foreign Minister from Israel was here. She spoke out very, very strongly about the lack of relationship. Labour have abdicated any relationship with Israel, responsibility, dialogue, and there is hostility between the two governments, which is simply unacceptable. That is unhelpful. There is a peace process that started today in Cairo. Britain has always had agency. We have great convening powers. Britain is no longer seen as a player in any of that. By the way, despite us having big equities in the Middle East, despite us having British nationals living across the Middle East as well, working, doing all sorts of things. So, that is one example. And then I've already spoken about China, for example, the inconsistencies there. I also think across Europe, let's just talk about Europe. So what have we seen from the Labour government? We've seen them spending more time trying to unravel aspects of Brexit, which is an ideological thing for them, rather than look at, forging much more constructive dialogue on security and defence. So my point being, the reason why I say that I was at the security conference last week, there is scepticism. Absolute scepticism, because people are now seeing through the so-called pledges around NATO that this government have given. Smoke and mirrors. Smoke and mirrors is a term that was used to me about what the Labour government is doing. So, you have to be sincere. Foreign policy is difficult. Foreign relations are difficult. Diplomacy is difficult. But if you're not sincere, if you're insincere, and you haven't done the hard 9 yards in building up trusted relationships, have difficult conversations, perhaps they just sit there with their scripts and just sort of turn the 5 pages of all the cases that they don't want to be raising and then just read out the bit from Rachel Reeves, then it's hard. And I think there's a lot the government is getting wrong. There's a bigger problem here, though. And that bigger problem is when you're insincere and not trusted, Britain's standing in the world decreases. And it goes down. And I think we are seeing that. We're absolutely seeing that. We really are, certainly from the interactions that I have. And I also would just put this in the context. I hear lots of things, obviously, from the international community, at forums I attend, from our wonderful diplomatic community in London. It's pretty, people are privately not massively critical, but they are, they're concerned. They have concerns, they really do. And so it's year one of this government. They've got to build bridges fast, I think, and they've got to demonstrate that they are sincere and serious. They've got to be serious about Britain's place in the world, our stand-in and our foreign policy.
Yeah. One more question for me before we turn to the audience. Obviously, everyone in this room will be conservative and definitely not considering reform. But if they were talking to someone who might be considering voting reform, as someone on the right of the party, what would your message to them be when it comes to foreign policy?
So I'm going to be I don't want to offend anybody for a start, but look, I've been a member of our party for 35 years. People know I'm, centre right on the right of our party, passionate and committed. I sit here today and I do what I do because I care about our country and our party. And I'm not going to vacate the pitch to a populist party that will tell you that the sky will be whatever colour you want it to be, whatever day of the week. And your foreign policy will be whatever you want it to be, whatever day of the week. You've just heard me speak about Labour, about being authentic, about being sincere, about doing the hard 9 yards with relationships. I think you actually have to have experience, experience of governments, experience of individuals around the world too, different governments. Obviously, I've done a few things, and across the party we have that. This issue is too important when you look at what goes on around the world. And the other point to make as well is that you've heard me speak about the axis of authoritarianism. What do they love? They love populism. They love creating chaos. They love disinformation. Look at what they've been able to do. I've mentioned Georgia, Moldova. There are other countries, Hungary, for example. There are other parts of the world where that axis of authoritarian has linked itself with populism. I don't think reform are at all credible when it comes to foreign policy. Look at their leanings towards Russia, for example. They've not been. They don't evangelise like we do about Ukraine. They're not out there talking about the values of freedom and democracy and the institutions in the way in which we are. We're two separate parties. So on that basis, there's no sort of like you move from Conservative to Reform if you care about our standing in the world and the type of foreign policy and the seriousness that we would bring to this whole agenda, when we come back to government and the level of threats and challenges that we face. My party, our party, has an extraordinarily proud record on supporting Ukraine, and that is something that Reform would never ever do. They've not been out there, championing the values, sovereignty, and even saying that Ukraine are fighting for the rest of us in the way in which we do. And by the way, tomorrow at 2:30 on the main stage, we've got a session on Ukraine, so you can please do come along to that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, questions? Show of hands. Great. Let's go to women here in front.
Thank you. The 2023 Women and Girls Strategy, which was launched by the Conservatives, I think by James Cleverly at the time, explicitly identified the well-funded and well-organised regressive actors that are seeking to use international spaces and online spaces to roll back gender equality. In a world where the Conservatives might be working with a much reduced aid budget, I'm curious, one, do you still see those actors as a threat, including to national security, but also what alternative tools would the party mobilise to try and resist those that are seeking to undermine the rights that are very important to all of us?
So if you look at our party's history on women and girls, it's outstanding. It is absolutely outstanding, it really is. Girls' education. We had a foreign secretary once who evangelised about girls' education around the world, and he led some extraordinary campaigns, by the way, in Afghanistan. I know because I went to Afghanistan and I saw that, and that was Boris. Boris, as foreign secretary, really paved the way on all of that. And there's mass investment, and you can only have those investments working with trusted partners. So, even women and girls, bad actors, this comes back to the level of integration that you have in government. You cannot have this just sitting in one government department anymore. And this is the point. It goes across some of information channels, misinformation, disinformation. And we know what takes place there. Rights. Look, we're a party that believes in democracy and the rights of citizens and individuals. We're always going to be a champion of those rights. We find partners to work with in those spaces as well. So things have moved on. And it's not always about the budgets. Of course, you need money for this. There's no question about that. We need new partnerships. We need technology. Technology is going to be the key driver to this. I mentioned earlier on the Syrian migration crisis and Zaatari. We spoke about Zaatari. So Zaatari was just an extraordinary camp for refugees. It was very sad, actually. But one of the things that we did do, we were able to bring education inside those camps to children. Thousands upon children. And we did that through technology. So, in Jordan and even in Lebanon, we did that through technology. So there are other ways in which we will do that. And you've got to have partnerships in government. Whatever one thinks, people go on about procurement and contracts. Obviously, that all exists there, and you've got to have proper frameworks. But there'll be different ways of doing this. And the one thing I would say, the Conservative Party, I'm going to say this, because I feel so strongly about this. My blood boils when I hear the Labour Party and the Labour government almost assume that they are the only ones with the moral high ground to even speak about this issue. Women, girls, the rights of girls' education, they were not there. We were the ones in government leading this agenda, and we will continue to grow that and develop it. And by the way, they're the ones now in government that are cutting back the money for this particular area.
Craig Smith in the front row.
Hi, Dame Priti. Thank you very much for your time and your insights today. I was very privileged early on this year to attend a trip to Jordan with the CGP and Ryan. Really insightful. And it gives us the opportunity to see firsthand what the impact of British overseas development aid makes on the ground, and in particular, the national security as well.
Yes, yeah.
Now, what we're seeing today, obviously, is an announcement of a £7 billion reduction. And that is going to be, no doubt, really popular on the doorstep, because I don't know about yourself, but I've certainly tried to sell ODA on the doorstep. It doesn't work. They're not interested. It's a great thing. We're getting rid of all this money. But are we not just kicking the can down the road for defence later on? But more importantly, my question really is about messaging. Is it now time to change the messaging on ODA and turn development into defence, and you sell it as that?
So, Craig, thank you. And that is a really, really good question. So, you would have seen on ODA spending this year, it was our party in opposition that persuaded the government to actually use the ODA budget to increase the defence budget. And it was James Cartledge and myself that worked on that proposal and proposition. We know how it works. We've got government experience. We know about how you can actually do that. And that's basically what we proposed to Keir Starmer. In the end, they had no choice but to do it. That was in the run-up to NATO, obviously, meeting earlier on this year, and all the big challenges around defence spending. You could make that argument. However, the one thing I would say is that one aspect of foreign policy, and this does also link to defence, it speaks to our security, is effectively some of the soft power tools that come with that as well. Look, I'm all for, tooling up a lot more. You know my posture when it comes to defence. We need to be out there in a much, much bigger way. We really do. That's powerful, that's important. We live in an insecure world as well. But at the same time, we have institutions that we still need to invest in, which promote democracy, freedom, values, free media, for example. There's no free media in Georgia and Moldova right now, thanks to Russia and even other countries too. So there are ways in which we speak about this through the security lens and keeping our country secure. So, we have to look at this in a totally different way, in my view. But that is because we live in a contested world, things have moved on, and we can't just sort of sit under the same sort of we shouldn't do is just adopt, what the sort of machinery of the state tells us to adopt, basically, is sort of like titles and, ways to describe things. This is about having the political will and the political agency to bring about the change that we need for our country and our place in the world. And I'm in the marketplace to do that at every single level.
Thanks. Just behind you, Gulai at the back.
Hi, Dame Priti. Thanks so much. I just wanted to expand a bit and ask you on Russia. You talked about reform a bit, but obviously in Wales we've seen the first sort of arrest of a politician linked to Russia. Do you think reforms links to Russia have been fully explored? And do you also think that the Conservative Party is doing enough to tell voters exactly in areas like your seats and parts of the country where actually there are links there? And how much more can we do to expose this and look at the Russia reform links?
Thank you for that. You've made a really important point, so thank you for bringing this up. So for the audience, you may have picked this up, that there was a former Reform elected member of the Welsh Authority, I think it was, who basically had been taking money from Russia. That's pretty serious, and clearly he's gone through a proper process, criminal process, etc., etc. This does come back to the Reform Russian links. The answer is no. I don't know why, to be honest. More hasn't been made of this, and I'm not talking about party, politically, but even within the news as well. Journalists, current affairs, when are people going to run the slide rule over this in the vigorous way in which it needs to be done? I think we've got a major issue brewing, actually, which is about foreign influence. And I did want to come on to sort of FIRS and level of foreign influence in our politics right now. That link clearly showed Reform are taking foreign money to influence politics and elections in this country, which is illegal and should not be happening at all. And, there are strong rules about that, and that's a national scandal. That is an absolute national scandal, it really is, and that does have to become much more public. From a party perspective, I would say this. I think, first of all, on issues of this nature and the severity of it, it's got to be done, and it's got to be made public. I genuinely think that, whenever we stand up and start criticising, it's a plague on everybody's houses, and you would say that and all of that. That's why we need the facts to come out behind all of this. We need the investigations, and we absolutely need the cases and the media to be reporting all this. I think it is extraordinary that did not get enough media reporting whatsoever, because if there's one example, there'll be other examples as well. And there are reports right now as well, Reform paying people to go over to their party, etc. Where did those resources come from? Why isn't there more scrutiny? Why aren't people asking more questions about it?
Questions? Yes, gentlemen, just here in the middle.
Thank you. Chris Bowman, Tunbridge Wells. In 2024, the average GDP per capita in the UK was $52,000. In China, it was $13,000. Why on earth are we begging them for investment?
I think that's a question for Rachel Reeves, to be perfectly honest, because we were in government for 14 years. Well, my approach to China when I was in government was not to go begging to them at all. Let me just be very clear about that. You know, I can absolutely vouch for my time in government on that particular issue. There's no doubt about that. I toughened up. We have new national security laws, which I actually drafted. I'm the architect of those laws when I was Home Secretary. You know, there are all sorts of measures that I can't even publicly talk around in terms of intelligence and security that were undertaken. There is an issue. There is a big, big issue and a big problem. And if the Labour government are now in power, and as I've said, look at the national security threat to our country from China, and yet we have a Labour government that are effectively going cap in hand to China. They're actually exposing greater national security threats and risks to our country, and that is unacceptable. My party will continue to call that out, and that is what we're trying to do.
Let's take two at a time. So, gentleman here has been very patient, and then just second row back.
Thank you. Priti, I can see in the not very distant future there being pressure for the United Kingdom to participate in so-called peacekeeping forces, whether it's in Syria, whether it's Ukraine, Gaza, or heaven forbid in Taiwan. To what extent do you think we should participate?
And then just two rows back.
Hi, Paul Cook from the One campaign. I just want to circle back to the soft power issue and the again to cover on the announced proposed cut to UK aid that was talked about this morning. So as you know, once we get down to 0.1%, we're really talking about very, very small levels indeed. You know, whether the UK would continue to have a role at the World Bank as on the board of the World Bank and various other international institutions like the Global Fund and others that every other G7 nation is there and present at and exercising its soft power into that space. Doesn't this, you know, represent a huge sort of rollback of UK soft power? And what do you think of the risks around that? How do we mitigate those risks?
Okay, so let me answer that question first, because I have spent a lot of time in this space, as you'll know. You really will. The answer is no. We don't vacate the pitch. We really don't. And let me just give you this example, because I used to have this a lot when I was in DFID. As much as we had big budgets and all the rest of it back then, you know, you can exercise your influence by bringing about change through new ways of working and new partnerships. Money is important, we know that, but it's also how you leverage that. I recapitalised CDC. So you'll be familiar with CDC. I recapitalised that. I even developed their business plan with them. And that business plan, when I last looked, was generating a 7% return on an annual basis. Well, you can't get that, you know, in most places right now. That's money that's going back into development around the world, thanks to the United Kingdom. So, you know, we have a role to play. And I think it's, if I may say so, you know, I don't think we should just be so wedded to, you know, the past ways of doing things. We've got to be much more innovative. We've got to find different ways of finding solutions. The World Bank is a classic example right now. So I would have very, very heated discussions with the former president of the World Bank as a UK shareholder that would turn up to those meetings. I wasn't a walk in the park, and I would not roll over in recapitalisation. I was following the money, people and outcomes. I want a fundamentally different way of doing aid and leveraging our influence and our budgets. And also, not only that, I'm a big believer in the role of the private sector. And I did that, for example, for the Global Fund. I effectively persuaded Bill Gates to put a lot more money in for every pound that we put in as well. So there are different ways in which you can tackle and deal with replenishments, and I think that's really important. I'm a big believer in that. I've done it, so I've had proof of concept, and I think there are other ways of doing this going forward. On the issue of peacekeeping, I've already said the world is in a very, very bad and difficult situation. We're not in government. We'd have to hold the government to account should it come to anything in terms of peacekeeping, coalition forces, you name it, around the world. I think, to be quite frank, Labour MPs are already going to demand a vote in Parliament and all of this. What really matters is the scrutiny around government decision-making, and the real issue will be what type of role does Britain play? and where will we be serving? And I still maintain that we are a force for good. It's not all about peacekeeping. There are other things that we can offer up as part of, protecting democracy, Western values, deterrence forces, etc. I've been engaged in some of those discussions already at the security conference I was in last week. So, we shouldn't just automatically assume that that is the route that we would go down. I think from our party's position, we would challenge a lot of that anyway. We really would. And would be putting forward alternative suggestions.
Just off the back of the question about the World Bank, could you say a bit about your experience with the UN? Because President Trump was obviously very critical, but that's a big multilateral player, and you would have had direct experience.
My experience with the UN was not a happy one. Let me just say that. And in fact, it was during President Trump's first term. The UN ambassador to the United States at the time was Nikki Haley. They felt I went far too far in my strident approach, calling for the United Nations to reform itself, be more accountable, bring in more transparency. I like a bit of transparency when public money is involved. They did not like any of that, and they basically said we thought we were going too far. And I said, well, I think you should join us on this journey, otherwise you'll end up caving into all sorts of pressures going forward, and look at where they are right now. So let me just share a couple of examples with you. I felt very strongly about the United Nations, that they were spending our money reinventing the wheel across all their agencies. The UN is full of different agencies, the UNRWAs of this world, the UNICEFs of this world, humanitarian people, you name it. And they would all do, I was there during the Syrian crisis, so, around 2016, 17, 18. They'd all turn up and they'd all have to commission their own needs assessments, for example. We scrapped all that. We made it abundantly clear you're not doing that. You're not spending all our money sending 3 different groups down or 5 different groups down, looking at the same situation and then doing different assessments. So we drove integration at the United Nations, which they knew they had to do. We stopped them from flying first class around the world, for example. They didn't like that conversation with me, but believe it or not, humanitarian workers do some of that as well. There was much more around some terrible scandals that I uncovered. So I uncovered the sexual abuse scandal within the United Nations and the aid agencies. That, for me, was the straw that broke the camel's back. It really was. It was just absolutely appalling and abhorrent. And I actually worked with some very renowned international lawyers to lead some prosecutions, help to really shine a light on all of this. So, the UN is an extraordinary organisation in its own right. It really is. Does a lot of great work around the world, but quite frankly, it's not fit for purpose in the contemporary sense. It needs reform. It needs fundamental reform. It needs much more accountability. I just don't believe in giving your money, hard-pressed taxpayers' money, to organisations that think that they can do what the hell that they want with it, without having transparency and accountability. And I don't actually think it's acceptable to just turn up to the General Assembly once a year and sort of get a readout as to where the money goes. That, for me, drove me nuts. I mean, it's just not right. It is not acceptable. And that speaks to my time at the World Bank as well. I was doing much more in terms of conditionality, wanting to see the business cases. I changed our own practices in DFID, which did upset a few people, around how we would put our money in, the business cases, the accountability. There's a lot of detail here, a lot of hard graft that goes into all of this. And I wanted to bring a lot of that to the United Nations.
Great. Let's take 3 questions. So at the back, Sam in the green.
Thanks. Pretty interested in your view on the merger with FCO and DFID and how it's sort of going.
Yeah.
It's still going, still integrating HR and all that kind of thing. I was involved in doing it in Canada 10 years ago, and that's still going. I supported both of them because I wanted DFID to be FCO'd rather than DFID to be FCO to be DFID.
Yeah.
And I speak to a lot of diplomats who are concerned that you've got a lot of senior DFID people who are project managers, big budgets, maybe emphasise the softer side of things, the multilateral side of things. But the FCO is kind of losing a bit of its edge on sort of harder edge in politics, on security matters with the Home Office, the kind of advice that they give. Is that something you recognise, and do you see any sort of opportunities ahead?
Sure, thank you.
Lydia, just here.
Hi, I'm Lydia Painter with BB Partners. Given the sort of scale of some of the crises that we're seeing around the world, particularly children dying of malnutrition and disease in conflict zones, but also given the reality of a reduced and possibly further reducing aid budget, if you were in government now, what are the areas that you would prioritise spend on? Because obviously things like malnutrition and disease you can't solve with soft power. Sometimes you do need cash.
Yeah, you do. Understood.
If I need just, gentleman just here. Just, sorry, that's it. Yeah.
Sorry, I will stand. My name is Timothy. I'm a North Korean escapee, and you mentioned the axis of authoritarianism, which we know North Korea, China, Russia,
yes,
and Iran. Last week, I spoke at the 60th UN Human Rights Council sessions on the DPRK, and on that session specifically, there were more dictators spoke and defended North Korea's human rights violations. And they kept on lingering around over me 3 times, tried intimidating and discouraging, not able to speak at the session. Even we had a message from one of the sources said they're gonna interrupt my speech. Thankfully, the UK's human rights ambassador, UN human rights ambassador for human rights, and came to see me twice and asking me, "Are you okay, able to speak?" So she encouraged me well, and so I was able to speak. But sadly, there was no US, no France. So UK was standing alone, speaking on these issues. China and Russia definitely were defending North Korea. So and I was gratefully hearing your perspective. The UN needs reform. But my question is directly is that how we continue able to stand on our own if US is not going to decide to coming back, or we also pull out from United Nations Human Rights Council sessions. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let me start. Let me start with your contribution. Thank you. Also, thank you for being there at the session and doing what you did. I mean, that is really quite remarkable, and it's great to see you here. And thank you for your contribution. I can't vouch for the US and France. I'm not even going to begin to vouch for France. But the United States, look, I genuinely believe there is work that we need to do with America on all of this. There really is. So, America, the view about America right now is that they're vacating the pitch on various issues. Maybe, maybe not. But this is about influence. And, I come back to the point that I made, Ryan, earlier on about the dialogue we have with America, for example. You work together, not always front of house, but behind the scenes. You share examples, you make the case, and you can actually have the support that's required. And the United States, I'm afraid we do know about, United States, North Korea, tensions, etc., etc. That's one thing. That is one thing. But when it comes to standing up to the axis of authoritarianism, North Korea is working with Russia right now to continue the war in Ukraine. Linked to that, we've got North Korea, China, all sorts of elements going on. And this has to be stopped. It really does. And the only way to do this is for the West to literally come together and show that we've got our axes of Western democratic values and we're going to fight for them and stand up. And your point about UN reform is well made, because the UN, you see this in voting blocks, don't you? Who votes for who and all this kind of stuff, and you'll follow this in a lot more detail, as I do as well. We need to break that. We really do. We've got to be really out there standing up for the fundamental values, rights and freedoms all over again. And Britain, in my view, has we've been a force for good. We have been a force for good in the world. We need to do things somewhat differently now going forward. But I'm not prepared to vacate the pitch to anyone on this. And that's why I said we're going to fight for Britain, fight for freedom, and be out there as a force for good in the world. And we'll do that in partnership with many friends and allies. But thank you for joining us, and thank you for your contribution. So let's just talk about aid. and I'm afraid, the sad state of actually aid, and actually aid not getting where it needs to get to. Let's be very honest about this. I'm sorry to say, but I've been to some sad places in the world, South Sudan, for example, northeast Nigeria, humanitarian crises, malnutrition crisis, children without food, the things that we find really incomprehensible. And I'm going to say it, but the system, including the UN system, completely failing to get through. We need to tackle all of that. We really do. We've got to sort that out. That does need money and that needs support. I also do think, whatever one thinks, even with the Gaza crisis as well, the humanitarian situation there are other ways in which food can get in and has got in. We need to find ways of doing that, and we're going to have to partner differently and work differently with organisations. That does cost money, but we need to do this in a different way going forward, and we cannot just sort of say, here's a cheque to X organisation, go away and do it, and then report back to us in 12 months' time. Those days are gone. They have really gone, because there's not enough accountability, and we have to follow the money, people, and the outcomes. We've got to be people-centric first and foremost, not institution-centric. And then Sam, on FCDO as it now is, because it was FCO, and the D is obviously for DFID. So I probably hear as much as you do, and the FCO part of life, they're very unhappy. They are very unhappy. And that is kind of like, because, our standing in the world and the harder-edged staff and the British diplomatic service is not what it once was. And I want to be the party that invests in all of that and integrates that in the right kind of way. We cannot have an FCDO that is just run by project managers. No disrespect to project managers or the skills and experience of development people within the Foreign Office itself. They'll be working incredibly hard. But, we can't just have the FCDO now just sort of going down that direction of travel. We need leverage, we need skin in the game. The world is a contested place. We've got great practitioners on development. That's all fine, but it is actually not working institutionally. So, I think we've got to really look at all of this. I'm having many discussions actually with some ex-diplomats, some ex-specialists as well, as to what we're going to do with the department and how we're going to make it fit for purpose.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. Thank you for your questions. Priti, thank you for being here. Thank you for your brilliant leadership on these issues. Can we thank Priti in the usual way?
Thanks, everyone. Nice to see you all.
Thanks.